Hey guys, what is up? SuperKmanrocks here, and I am here finally for my first bit of 2022 World Championship coverage. I am so excited to get here. We are done with the summer split. We are done with the summer playoffs for all four major regions. It is now finally time to get into the coverage for the biggest event that lolesports will put on all year long here in the World Finals. I am very excited to talk about it. We've got a ton of really interesting coverage here. As you all know, I have been covering all four of the major regions all year long on this channel, and so I'm going to use this primer series to kick off our Worlds coverage. We're going to be going through all four of the groups in the main group stage, as well as all of the play-in teams in their own separate videos, talking about the advantages, the strengths, the weaknesses that all of these teams have, where I think that they are going to fall inside of their groups, as well as give a full power ranking. I will be power ranking all 15 of the major region teams, as well as the two teams being obviously the Flying Oysters and GIM that did make it into group stage. So that's going to be 17 teams power ranked. I will be talking a bit about the others when we get into our play-in stage video, but for now, I'm not going to power rank them. I'm going to power rank the main stage teams, and then we can kind of talk about where the others may fall in that kind of grouping. But if you guys are excited for this content, not only this video, but for the videos that are going to be coming out throughout the rest of the month, let me know down in the comment section below. We've got a ton of awesome world coverage. You already saw the intro to this video. We're really going ham this year for some awesome Worlds coverage. So if you guys are excited, let me know down in the comment section below. But let's go ahead and jump right into our team by team analysis. We're going to be kicking things off with Group A, the first group that was drawn for the 2022 World Championships. We're going to be going pool by pool by pool, starting of course with our Pool 1 team from Group A, which is of course the winners of the LCS in summer of 2022. Of course, I am talking about Cloud9. Now, this is a very intriguing team to talk about on the world stage because not a lot of people, me included, even expected them to be here, especially after how the regular season went. They were the 5 seed going into playoffs. They clearly, to me, felt like a top 4 team, but maybe not, top 3. It very much felt like the top 3 was very solidified going into playoffs, but Cloud9 really found their footing. A lot of that was due to some of the players really finding a play style that worked for them and the team really being able to play around that in a good way. And they basically cruised their way to an LCS title, sweeping it 3-0, the only sweep in the LCS playoffs this year. And so a lot of hype around this Cloud9 team right now. And honestly, a lot of times I usually think that playoff darlings aren't quite as strong going to the world stage. I tend to prefer continued success over the course of the year rather than just a big boost of success towards the back half of the playoffs. But this Cloud9 team's a little bit different. I think a lot of their problems ended up being not knowing exactly what style was going to be best for them, and they ended up finding a style that was kind of counter to the meta that really works towards the players that they have. And once they gelled and clicked on that, everything fell into place for them, and that actually gives me a lot more confidence, I think, in this Cloud9 team to do well at this World Championship. You can see that I have them power ranked 10th here. It's not super optimistic, but I think it is relatively realistic. You'll get a better idea as we go through the series of the teams that might be ahead of them, the teams that might be behind them. I implore you guys to maybe think of your own power rankings down in the comment section below and maybe compare them to what I'm doing, but they come in number 10 for me. They're kind of right on that barrier, probably one of the better bottom, a lower half teams, I should say. And I think that a lot of that has to do with the feast or famine aspect of their game. I really do believe that even power ranked at 10th, this team can beat a lot of the best teams at Worlds in a best of 1. And I think they're going to get the chance, obviously, to do that. A very stacked group here, but the mechanical talent on this team for a North American roster is absolutely insane. Obviously, we can start talking about the guy who completely dominated the finals, was super awesome throughout the playoffs, really just got better throughout the year, and that is Berserker in the bottom lane. Obviously, the huge import that Cloud9 made over the course of the offseason was bringing in Berserker, was making sure that he was given an opportunity. Obviously, a former substitute for T1, a former player on their challenger team, and He gets brought over to Cloud9 with the LS experiment. Obviously, things fall apart a little bit quickly there, but he gets retained, and he has honestly been everything that they could have hoped for and more. He is one of the most mechanically talented players in the LCS, in the West, period. He is dominant, and really what inspired me about Berserker throughout the playoffs is you go watch his series against CLG, and it's like, okay, like, you know, in the regular season, he certainly had his hiccups. He wasn't really that carry presence. This team didn't really play around him, and it was kind of the same in the CLG series. He was getting Zeri a lot, and it really wasn't looking all that strong for him. But throughout the playoffs, he continued to practice, he continued to grow, and by the end of the playoffs, he was absolutely dominant, not only on all of the meta champions, but on that Zeri pick, which, honestly, he wasn't really as dominant on as you would have hoped he would have been throughout the course of the year. And so, to see that growth, to see that progression from Berserker throughout the playoffs, I think was super duper good. Obviously, you're pairing him up with Sven in the support position, former AD carry player, has really adapted to his role, has just gone full Enchanter. Really, there's not a lot of anything else coming out from him. There's a little bit of Nautilus, we've seen that, and even the Alistar, I think we've seen once or twice, but I've been saying it all year long. Sven's champion pool is not all that diverse at the support position. It's really been Yuumi, and then when Yuumi's banned out, it's been Lulu. And obviously, we've seen some Renata games as well, but at the end of the day, it's really been those two picks that I think C9 has gone to a lot, and there are definitely worse picks to go to. Probably the two strongest supports in the meta right now. It'll be interesting to see if this team starts to adapt to some of the more meta supports that we get at the World Championship. I'll be doing a meta report later in the month, but it's not going to be the exact same bot lane meta that we've been seeing throughout the year. I think some people are going to be excited about that, but it's certainly going to leave a lot in turmoil. It'll be interesting to see what happens with Berserker and Sven, but they might be the most talented bot lane that we have coming out of the West just at Worlds this year. They are genuinely phenomenal. If Sven can get on those more safe picks and just enable Berserker to be a dominant player, that's going to be huge for them. And then you've got the other carry, the one that they actually do tend to play through. While Berserker and Sven are great, they often don't invest a lot of resources into them. It's really just them winning a lot in the 2v2, and the rest of the team kind of pulling the jungle attention away so that they have a lot of opportunities to just play on their own. But the place that Cloud9 really likes to invest a lot of their resources in is the jungle position here with Blabber. Now, we've seen Blabber multiple times on the international stage for many years now. I've said this, and I know it's a little bit of a controversial opinion, but Blabber, I think, is the most talented endemic North American player we have ever had. I think he's more talented than Doublelift. I think he's more talented than, you know, insert any other North American player you have here, right? I think just in terms of pure takeover ability, I would take Blabber over almost anybody. And I think we saw that a little bit in the playoffs here. Even though Berserker kind of stole the show in terms of winning that 2v2, Blabber was given a lot of attention here, obviously from Jensen, which we'll get to, but from Fudge as well, and even from enemy junglers really trying to shut him down because they know that if Blabber gets behind, it can be a little bit more difficult for Cloud9 to generate wins, but he was so consistent at being able to generate those early game leads on champions that I'm really, really hoping to see more from him of. The Wukong, obviously, in the finals was the big one. Super dominant on that pick. You pair him up with the Yuumi from Sven in the support position. He is basically unkillable at that point. But even things like the Trundle, we've seen him pull out things like the Poppy in the past. Really, any of these early game aggressive junglers, obviously he's known for Xin Zhao, or at least he was a couple of years ago. There are things that he can go to that I think are going to be a big deal for other teams to stop. Really, the lifeblood of Cloud9 runs through Blabber in the jungle. And if he can really get going, this is where I can say, like, I truly do believe that they can beat anybody in the world in a best of one, is the fact that if Blabber gets, like, snowballed out of control, I truly believe that there's almost no team in the world that's going to easily be able to stop that. I'm not going to say that, you know, Blabber getting snowballed is a guaranteed win or anything like that, but he is so aggressive and he pushes his tempo so much from ahead that when they're winning, they're actually a very, very, very difficult team to stop. And so overall, I would say that Blabber is the reason that I have so much optimism around this Cloud9 team. But then you go to Fudge and Jensen as your solo laners. Fudge definitely upgraded a lot this season. Obviously, not someone that I think a lot of people expected to be one of the better top laners in the region, basically from the get-go after switching back from mid lane in spring, but he really took his role and ran with it really, really hard throughout the playoffs especially. He was the best top laner in the LCS, and it really wasn't all that close. Obviously, Sumeday's a very good player, and he was second in my MVP voting for the regular season, but Fudge made him look completely inept in both of the times that they played him in a best of 5. He has been incredibly impressive. If he can maintain that lane dominance and use that pressure that he was able to generate a lot in side lanes to be able to help out Blabber, to be able to push forward for objectives on the top side, that's really the game plan that Cloud9 likes to push forward as much as possible. And then you've got Jensen in the mid lane. Now, I've been a little bit lower on Jensen, I think, than the majority of people. I still think he's a very good mid laner. He's certainly not the carry player that he used to be, and a lot of that is reflected in the champions that he has had the most success on throughout the playoffs. We're talking the LeBlanc, which, you know, LeBlanc's not all that good right now. I know everybody thinks like, oh, LeBlanc one-shotting backliners. That's not really what LeBlanc does right now. Her damage is a little bit lower. She just has a ton of utility in terms of her chain and her ability to poke people out of fights. And then the other two picks have been Orianna and Zilean. Both picks that I think are relatively weak in the meta right now. At least Orianna is. Zilean not so much, but he just doesn't have that carry potential. Both picks that are very supportive, and really what Jensen does is he likes to shove his wave as fast as possible and then do whatever he needs to do to help Blabber get ahead. That's really been, like I said, Cloud9's strategy. Jensen is a big facilitator of that. The Zilean was absolutely enormous for them in the finals, and I would imagine that is a pick that they continue to go back to throughout Worlds. So, what are the team's strengths? Well, I honestly think the aggression is a huge strength of Cloud9. When this team does generate a lead, which I believe they can do against a lot of teams in the world, early game can be so matchup dependent and draft dependent that I definitely think there are going to be opportunities for this team to generate some early game leads, even against some of the best teams in the world. If they get that, there is honestly a chance that they push that lead to the point where the other team is just down 4 or 5k gold at 15-20 minutes, and it's a lot more difficult for them to come back into that game at that point. I think that's a huge advantage for this team. Also, in terms of Western teams, they have phenomenal mechanical prowess. You know, in comparison to a lot of the other teams that North America and Europe are sending this year, I think this team does have the mechanics to be able to keep up with teams in lane, most especially this bot lane. I really think they don't get a lot of attention from their jungle, and therefore they don't get a lot of attention from the enemy jungler, and I think that's honestly into their benefit because they've often been able to consistently win those 2v2s in the bot lane. And so I think that is a strength for this team. I'm not sure if it's going to be a strength at a Worlds level, but it certainly has been throughout the year. And then I think the last strength is mostly draft. They really do understand their playstyle and how they want to execute on it, and they really have been able to refine that over the course of the playoffs into a version of them that I really do believe they think is best. Fudge on some sort of aggressive, maybe split pusher in the top lane, Blabber on the Wukong or the Trundle or whatever, right? Being able to go in, create plays early on, fight for objectives. Jensen on an enabler for Blabber, and then Berserker and Sven on something that can carry in the late game, and then something that enables that. They've really found their niche, and I think that that's really unlocked a lot of them. Now, there are problems that come with that because I do believe they're a little bit more bannable than other teams. Maybe not so much the bot lane, but I think Jensen is particularly bannable. If you ban out the Zilean and the Orianna, basically force him onto something like LeBlanc, I think the early game is a little more in turmoil for Cloud9, but outside of that, I really do think that they have a good idea of how they want to play the game, and as long as they stick to that, I think they're going to be in a good spot. As for their weaknesses, again, kind of wrap around to their strengths. They can often get a little bit over-aggressive when they're not ahead, and that can be a little bit of a problem for this team that is going to play some of the best teams in the world in their group. If they're not in a position to be able to fight, I really don't see an opportunity for this team to generate leads after the fact. They're not a very good team playing from behind, and I would expect that to continue throughout Worlds here. And so, really, their game plan is going to have to be play around Blabber, make sure that he can generate that lead in the early game, hope Berserker and Sven can hold up in what is a very tumultuous group for bot laners, and just hope that you can generate that early lead and translate that, snowball that into a few wins in this matchup. But overall, I think Cloud9 is going to, they've had a great year, and I think they're going to be very happy to get here. Obviously, not a great group draw. North America's #1 seed often does not get that. But at the end of the day, they are a team that I think more so than almost any other team has the potential to upset pretty much anybody, and it's going to be really, really exciting to watch this team push forward at the World Championships. All right, moving on to our Pool 2 team here from Group A. We got the best matchup that we could possibly get. I popped off in my reaction video, which if you haven't checked it out, go check it out. It's up in the right corner right now. But the Pool 2 team here to face Cloud9 in Group A is going to be T1, the #2 seed from the LCK, the team that got swept in the LCK finals. But they're a lot better, I think, than what they showed in that finals. And I'm going to take a big leap here. I think a lot of people are going to have this team pretty low in terms of their power rankings, their quote-unquote global rankings, but I actually have a lot more faith in this team, I think, than others in T1 in general. They're going to come in at number 4 for me in my power rankings. Some people are going to see that as absolutely blasphemous, but I do think it's a very close matchup between, like, even just, like, 2 or 3 to, like, I don't know, 6. I think they're all very, very close in terms of actual skill, but T1 for me is going to come in here at number 4, and I think that there is a lot of good to this team that people are forgetting about because the last half of their season didn't quite look the way that they wanted them to. This team still didn't lose a single best of 5 until MSI in spring. Like, they still were completely undefeated in the LCK. Like, that is something to keep in mind. They didn't lose a best of 3, they didn't lose a best of 5 until MSI. Like, they were completely unbeatable over the course of spring. Then Gen G kind of leveled up a bit coming into summer, and now all of a sudden we're looking at T1 as this team that is absolutely unwinnable good, like, not nearly as good as any of the teams coming out of the LPL, and that's just something I don't personally agree with, and I certainly can't, I'm not going to predict that here. I'm going to predict them to be about the 4th best team here at the World Championships. I believe that LCK is going to overperform a lot of expectations, and T1 is a big part of that, but what exactly does this team do? How does this team win games? Well, honestly, throughout summer, a lot of it was kind of counter meta, and a lot of it was through the top lane, which I don't think a lot of teams were actively doing, especially in the LCK. A lot of teams were not playing through that top side. You really weren't seeing a lot of top laners be quote-unquote carry threats, but Zeus was certainly not shy to pull out some more aggressive picks in lane, try to win, try to snowball the game out of control. A lot of that was due to the early pressure that Owner created so consistently, but Zeus is kind of the guy on this team now. In my opinion, he is the best player on T1. It's crazy to me that that is so clear, but to me, it very much feels very clear to me that Zeus has been the best player on this team throughout the year. We've been seeing him on some more aggressive picks, even when he plays tanks, he plays Gnar, but he plays the Gwen, he plays the Gangplank, things like that have been coming out from him. I expect to see those aggressive picks translate into Worlds. They really like to generate that lead in the top side. Very similar to Cloud9 in this respect of they have a very good bot lane that they don't typically like to play around because they're so consistent in the 2v2. I know a lot of people have been really down on Gumayusi and Keria as a duo lane throughout the year. I certainly have not been on that train. I think they have almost become underrated at this point in terms of community sentiment. Yes, they have not been perfect, but they have still been very good, and I think there are definitely games that have been won because these two were on T1 that they wouldn't normally have. I just think the top side has overshadowed them a little bit because they're the ones with the resources. So similar to Cloud9 in that respect, where I think a very, very good bot lane that just doesn't often become the focal point, I think, for T1. But Guma and Keria are both still really good. Guma much more of a late game carry nowadays. I don't really know how to feel about that. You see his most played champions are Kalista, Draven. That was very good for him early in the season when they could really invest in him, but they started to move away from those picks towards the back half. A lot more Zeri, a lot more Sivir, a lot more things that are just going to go relatively even in lane and then translate into some late game team fighting. His positioning has gotten better, I think, over the course of the split, but Guma definitely still has points in the game where he's just going to be caught out, and you're really hoping that he can improve on that. Keria, I think, has just kind of been a little bit lost in terms of the meta. He's really not an Enchanter player. He's been pulling out the Renata, but outside of that, you're seeing a lot of Nautilus, you're seeing a lot of Tom Kench. These are definitely more engaged picks that I don't think are quite as meta as you would want them to be. Neither of them aren't meta, but at the same time, you want to see him be able to pull out the Lulu and things like that and be able to succeed on it, especially if they're going to go something like the Zeri, but again, I think that's something that they felt a little bit more comfortable going to towards the back half of the split. It'll be interesting to see if they move further in that direction, as, in my opinion, Enchanters got better going into the World patch, but or if they just continue to go for this more engaged style in the bot lane, try to pressure out early with something like the Kalista, maybe even go to something like the Draven. Obviously, Guma's super familiar on his classic pick. But it'll be interesting to see what they do there, or if they continue to invest a lot into that top side, making sure that Zeus can get a little bit more of an aggressive pick in that top side, be able to translate that lead into the mid game where they basically just take over top side of the map. Owner does a great job with that as well. Obviously, a ton of early game picks from him. He's really the only player at Worlds that I would say is like really pulling out Lee Sin. There were a lot of really good Lee Sin players at Worlds, but not a lot of them were going to him throughout the course of the year because Lee Sin, honestly, it just hasn't been all that good as a pick right now. I still don't think he's all that good, but he's definitely pickable, and Owner is very, very, very good at him, and so definitely something to consider there. But the Wukong, the Trundle, the Poppy, things like that are definitely still on the table for Owner. Definitely not things that I would rule out for this T1 team. He's very flexible as long as he's able to generate that lead early. And I think very similar to Cloud9, they also have a mid laner whose main job on this team has been enabling the rest of the team. And that's very weird to say, but that's really what Faker has been throughout the year. You can talk about him being the greatest player of all time, and I really don't think a lot of people are going to argue you with that, but it's crazy to see him take such a passive role on a team where, you know, a bold take here, he's kind of been the worst player on this team over the course of the year. I know a lot of people are going to say that's the bot lane, but Faker's just not been all that consistent for this team. He's been picking up a lot of the Lissandra, he's been picking up a lot of the Talia, things like that have been really a big pick for them. Towards the back half of the year, though, he did start going to the Azir, the Ahri, a lot more, especially in playoffs. These are obviously picks that he is giga famous for, and it was kind of insane that he wasn't actively picking these things throughout the year. But I think when this team really started to need to get wins in the playoffs, when they stopped kind of messing around with whatever their drafts ended up being, they started going to some more carries in the mid lane, some things that could make an impact towards the back half of the game. I'm expecting to see more of that come Worlds time. But either way, I think Faker is going to be an impact player. It's just whether or not it's going to be in the way that we've become so accustomed to seeing Faker be an impact player as kind of the big carry towards the back half of the game at this World Championships. But the strengths and weaknesses of this team, strengths is just 1 to 5. It's just the pure talent of this team. You pretty much have a group of 5 that can win against almost anybody in the world. Really, the only lane, quote-unquote, that isn't super strong in the early game recently has been this bot lane, but I think that's going to turn around. I think with more prep time, maybe a little bit more exposure, I think Gumayusi and Keria are just simply too good to be able to have the form that they had towards the back half of the regular season. I would expect them to go to some more aggressive picks in the early game and be able to push that pressure a little bit more. But you're looking at Zeus, you're looking at Owner. Those have been two of the most dominant players in the LCK this year, regardless of position. And then Faker, obviously, I think is someone who always steps up on the biggest stage, whether or not he's had the most dominant year of all time or whatever, right? Like, the Azir, the Ahri picks, I think are going to become significantly more common for him as we come out into the playoffs here, and I think he's going to be just fine. For other strengths, I think map control has been absolutely huge for T1. They don't play quite the same controlled style that they've always played. You know, that idea you have of SKT from Season 5 of this team that wants to go to 35, 40 minutes every single game. They're not quite that anymore, but Owner does a great job of making sure that he controls the jungle, and he gets a lot of help from Faker in that regard as well. Very similar to what we get from Blabber. When Owner gets an early lead, he's able to snowball that entirely out of control. I just trust T1 to do it significantly more. And then also the other positive is just they're one of the few teams that I think genuinely can just straight up win the game through the top lane. Whether it's on team fighters, whether it's on split pushers, hell, whether it's even on tanks. Zeus is that kind of player. I think he's one of the very few players in the world that you can genuinely put all of the resources into in that top lane spot, and he will be able to win you the game straight from there. And so a lot of positives for T1. Negatives has been consistency throughout the year. Really, I think this team has really struggled to prove that they're the best team in the world. Obviously, not being able to beat RNG in MSI Finals isn't ideal. And then really kind of not having the same kind of summer split that you would want them to have, even though it still was very good. They would drop games here or there to teams that they absolutely had no right to. They get completely swept in the finals. You just want to see this team play the best version of themselves, and I have a lot of faith that we're going to be able to get that at Worlds, but I can understand that there are a lot of people that maybe are a little bit more hesitant on that because of the recent form that T1 has thrown at us. But if we get the best version of T1, it's going to be one of the best teams in the world, period, end of stop, and I'm definitely leaning more towards that than I am the latter. Alright, now that we've covered the first 2 pool seeds, there is one more team left to cover as we go through Group A confirmed teams here at the very least. And it's going to be our Pool 3 seed. Now, Pool 3 is actually unbelievable. It's incredible the amount of talent that we get at the World Championships every year. We've basically gotten to a point now where if you make the World Championships, you are one of the best teams in the world. And that is proven by the fact that the Pool 3 team here in Group A is last year's defending world champions, Edward Gaming, out of the LPL. A complete and utter devastation to Cloud9 fans when this name was drawn for Group A. Having to play against T1 and EDG in group stage is certainly not ideal for what you want to do here, but EDG definitely had some rough moments throughout the year, and they're definitely a team that I think is relatively beatable, maybe more so than people are giving them credit for. However, the big thing with EDG, they really turned it on through the back half of the split. Really, you can talk about this team sitting for most of the year at somewhere around like 5 to 7 in the LPL, at least that's where they were in my power rankings throughout most of the split. But man, as soon as they figured out that they had Viper on their team and they realized like, oh yeah, like Viper's our best player, let's put everything into our bot lane. It was a completely different ball game for this EDG team. They had easy work of RNG in the playoffs, and then they really took care of LNG in a really, conclusive fashion, I would say, as well, for them to get the number 3 seed. Now, they're going to come in my power rankings at number 5, and a lot of people are going to see that as maybe potentially a little too low for EDG, which is crazy to say, but it's between them and T1 for 4 and 5. I actually think it's really interesting that those two get drawn into the same group because I think they're right on the cusp for each other. The 4 and the 5, for me, I think EDG falls in at number 5 just because of the lack of consistency that they showed throughout the regular season. I definitely think this team has the upside to be the best team in the world, just like they were last year. I actually predicted them to win Worlds last year going into the tournament. They very much did not make me look good in the group stage, but they came through in the clutch as we got to the knockout stage. Hopefully, we can get a similar showing from EDG this year. So, how do they like to play? Well, like I said earlier, this team really found its most success after moving away from really camping and focusing a lot through the mid lane and scout and really moving a lot more towards the bot lane with Viper and Mako. We've been talking about the bot lanes first with a lot of these teams. That's because a lot of these teams have very, very good bot laners. This is a group with Berserker, Gumayushi, and Viper as the bot lanes. An absolutely absurd group of talent they are going to Worlds in this group for the bot lane. But Viper is the one I think that definitely gets the most amount of resources, and that's why I think EDG could actually be a pretty big issue for a lot of the teams that they're facing in this group, especially for C9 and for T1 to a lesser extent as well, because those teams really thrive off the fact that they can pull junglers away from the bottom lane, really create those 2v2 situations where they can hope that their bottom lanes can succeed in a situation quite like that. Obviously, the 4th team that we'll get to that's probably going to be joining this group, kind of similar in that respect as well, but EDG certainly not that. In fact, pretty much all of their successes come from funneling through Viper, making sure that he can get on a late game champion and pushing for him in the early game to be able to generate that lead basically on his own. He's just such a good player, in my opinion. He is a top 1 or 2 AD carry in the world. He's my number 1 AD carry in the LPL. I think he proved that throughout the playoffs, that was absolutely the right call. I know a lot of people have Gala up there as well, but he really was just straight up better than Gala, I think, for a majority of the games that they played against each other. And obviously, he's got a pretty good support to help him out. Mako is here. Now, I will say the thing about Mako through this year is that he wasn't always great. He definitely turned things up in the playoffs where it really felt like he kind of got a better grasp of the meta, going to some more picks that are enabling Viper. You can see his win rates on champions like Nautilus and Lulu, not great. That win rate on Braum, though, spectacular, really being something that can enable Viper in the early game to generate that lead, and then Viper can just do all the work, basically. From there, Mako just has to basically stand in his way and make sure that he's not in danger. I think those two have definitely developed a much better synergy than they had at the beginning of the year, which is crazy because they had a great synergy last year as well. It just seemed like the meta wasn't really all that figured out by EDG until about midway through the year. Once they got that, I think Viper and Mako definitely got a little bit more online as a bot lane duo, but it's still not perfect. Definitely not the most perfect bot lane. I think you can take advantage of Mako's over-aggressiveness. That's something that I think that is going to be a little bit of an issue for this team, but at the end of the day, they're so talented that I'm not sure the consistency with which you're going to be able to do that. As for the top side of this map, you've got Flandre obviously up in the top lane. You're running back the same 5 that you had at the World Championship last year. Flandre's had some good moments. He's had some bad moments. He's been very consistent on more passive picks, I think, throughout the course of the year. They've wanted to go to those more aggressive picks, things like the Gangplank, the Renekton, hell, even the Aatrox a lot more in the playoffs. Those picks I definitely understand wanting to go to with Flandre. You want him to have a little bit more of that impact towards the team fights. Even something like the Gnar, I think, can be a little bit more aggressive than, the Ornn or the Sejuani, right? Something in that regard. That's really not something that EDG has gone to a ton, but Flandre has also been able to be taken advantage of. They basically spend no attention up into the top lane. That could be a problem against a team like T1, even against a team like C9 that does like to invest in those side lanes, like those Fiora, Jax lanes that C9 typically likes to bring out, and so could definitely be something interesting there, but Flandre is just such a talented player. I expect him to be able to get his groove back, and he should be fine at Worlds. And then you've got JJ and Scout. Now, these two I'm going to group together because they very much feel like a duo as players. Really, like I said, the big issue for EDG earlier in the year was that JJ was still playing last year's meta in which he was investing a lot into Scout, who was playing a ton of things like Corki, and it really just wasn't where even Azir was like a hugely big pick for them in the early part of the season, but they were investing into the Azir, which really isn't something that you want to do in this meta right now. And I think Scout, unfortunately, just wasn't in a position to be able to carry games. They were losing against a lot of the better teams because of that, and they put themselves kind of in a hole to climb out of. They actually replaced JJ halfway through the season with Junjia, who is their substitute jungler here, and he really started investing into that bot lane, and I think that opened up a ton. At the time, I was telling everybody that Junjia was simply just going to be better for this team than JJ was, because he at least had an idea of how he wanted to play the game that was a little bit more conducive to the rest of the team and the meta that we currently had. But JJ comes back in for the playoffs. They feel more comfortable with him as a player because, quite frankly, he is the better player. I think he picked up a lot from Junjia as he starts to invest a lot into that bot lane now as well, and I think this is the best of both worlds. If you get that out of JJ, you're going to be in a good spot. My biggest concern is that I really don't love his champion pool and what he's been pulling out for a majority of the year. You see a lot of the top picks, things like Vi and Viego and Lee Sin. None of these are picks that I would consider all that dominant in the meta right now. Vi is something we've seen almost completely fall out of the meta, at least throughout playoffs in a lot of the major regions. Things like Viego are not existent anymore, and then Lee Sin is just one of those picks you have to be so good at that champion to pull him off because he does absolutely no damage after 10 to 15 minutes into the game at this point. And so JJ definitely going to need, I'm going to need to see a little bit more out of the late game scaling, maybe the more early game aggressive, like junglers, like the more meta ones, I guess I should say, for me to feel entirely confident about him. That's a big reason they come in slightly below T1 here, but for Scout, I think, again, he really adapted to the meta towards the back half. He was playing a lot of the Corki, a lot of the Azir towards the beginning part of the season, trying to carry from that mid lane position. It's just not what you need to do in 2022. He really adapted, started picking up the Sylas, started picking up the Talia. This really helped out the team a lot. Talia is a huge pick for EDG. It's a really, really good pick for a lot of teams around the world, and I think Scout really embodied that. Sylas is something that I expect them to pick up a lot in the Worlds cycle. I still think it's an incredibly strong pick that is incredibly versatile and does really well into a lot of the other mid lane matchups. Overall, I think my thing with EDG, the positives and the negatives, like their strengths is that they are consistent. Like at least the version that we've seen from them now has become an incredibly consistent team. They're not really like dominant in any one area except for Viper towards the late game, but it's not like he's like ridiculously dominant in lane. He's just one of the best in the world in the lane, right? Like, but you know, he's not someone who's going to generally win lane 24/7 no matter what. They invest in him all the time, like blah, 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 blah. He's going to still pick things like the Zeri, like the Aphelios, like the Sivir. He's not going to pick the Draven. He's not going to pick the Lucian. He can pick it, but it's just not something that this team has often wanted to go to, and so the lane phase isn't necessarily dominant. That could be a strength for this team, is the fact that really all of these lanes can be invested into and you can win through them. Bot lane, definitely the priority with that, but all of these players are good. You're pretty solid across the board, but that also comes with a little bit of a weakness in the fact that I don't really think they have this like dominant strategy that they can go to over and over and over again that they feel entirely consistent with. I think obviously Cloud9 has certainly found that strategy with investing into the jungle position, making sure that Blabber can really do whatever he wants and then have the 2v2 be as protected as possible in the bot lane. I think T1, to an extent, has found that as well with the similar thing of investing a lot into your top lane and having the bot lane 2v2 kind of be pulled apart and have a lot of resources spread towards the top side. I don't think EDG quite has that mindset that those other two teams have. The closest thing they have is what they had towards the back half of the regular season, like I said, investing in Viper, but they really did start to move away from that in the playoffs, started to go some more passive picks. So it'll be interesting to see what this team does. I have faith in the talent on this team, which is why I'm really not all that concerned, and the reason I have them at 5th, but I think some people are hyping them up just a tad bit too much. I'm not necessarily on the train that they are one of the world favorites, at least at the moment. I think they're a very, very, very good team that is maybe not stellar in enough areas for me to consider them one of the best teams in the world, but this is a team that should very much be looking to win this group. It's all about if they can kind of adapt to what the rest of the teams in here are doing, if they can play against their styles a lot better. That's something EDG does well, or if they're going to be taken advantage of for maybe some of their more passive play in the early game. It's going to be a wait-and-see approach with this team, but at worst-case scenario, they are one of the best teams in the world. I just don't know if they're going to be world championship quality this year. All right, well, that is going to do it for my in-depth analysis of the 3 confirmed teams here in Group A of the World Championships. Obviously, Cloud9, T1, EDG, all 3 really good teams. Up on the screen now, you're going to be seeing my Group A predictions. You will have probably gathered this from my power rankings, but I actually have T1 finishing in first place in this group. I know a lot of people are going to be taking EDG as the team to beat in this group, but for me, I expect T1 to come out firing in the group stage. I would expect them to be a little bit more consistent than EDG. I don't really see T1 as a team that is going to likely lose to Cloud9, or we'll talk about the fourth team in a bit, the likely fourth team in a bit, but I really don't see this being a situation where T1 is going to be all that contested. I really just think they do what the other teams in this group do, but slightly better. And so for me, they're going to come in at number 1. EDG is going to come in at number 2. They do have maybe potentially higher highs because I think Viper is the best player in this group. I think he is the best single player in this group, but I just don't know as a team if they're the most consistent. So for me, unfortunately, they come in at number 2 here. I think that there is a chance that they can beat T1 in both of these games. I also think there's a chance that they lose a game to a team like Cloud9, that they lose a game to a team like Fnatic, potentially. And so for me, I think for consistency reasons, they come in at number 2, but for me, if I'm predicting the two teams that come out of this group, I'm going to predict with the spread, with what is most likely here, and that's going to be T1 and EDG being the two teams to emerge. That leaves Cloud9, unfortunately, finishing in 3rd. I think there were a lot of groups that I would actually have taken Cloud9 in this Worlds. I actually think them, switching them and 100 Thieves, I think would have been an incredibly interesting thought experiment, but unfortunately they end up in a group here with two teams that are just really, really, really good, and they're going to have an uphill battle to climb. It doesn't mean that they're locked in to this number 3 spot. Honestly, of any of the teams, they feel like one of the most likely number 3 teams of all the groups, in my opinion, to be able to upset one of the top 2 teams. I really do believe that they can take a game off of EDG. They can take a game off of T1. I think it's possible for this team because truly, when they get rolling, I do think they are very difficult to stop. It's just about the consistency with which this team can win in the early game. I think a lot of the other teams are going to be prepared. And unfortunately, talent-wise, I'm just not sure if the bot lane can hold up in the same way that it did in the LCS at the World stage. Obviously, if Berserker is that dude, we're going to find out at Worlds, but he's going to need to prove it for me to feel confident. So Cloud9 does come in at a pretty confident number 3 here. And then the number 4 seed, obviously, we don't know who it is yet. It's going to be, one of the teams coming out through the play-ins. If we're just going based off of the major regions, it's likely to be either Mad Lions or Fnatic. In my opinion, I think it's most likely to be Fnatic. I'm not going to spoil anything about my play-in predictions. We'll be doing a full video on that, but I think Fnatic's probably the most likely team coming out of here in Group A, and so I'm going to talk about them here and their chances. I'll be doing a full preview of them when we get to the play-in groups, but I think in terms of their matchup against some of the other teams here, I think to me, they're clearly the worst team in this group. I think even when you talk about Cloud9, you could talk about Fnatic having a little bit more talented of a roster, but even then, I'm really not convinced about that. Like, Fnatic's got upset, and that's awesome, but C9 has Berserker, and I think that's at worst a push, you know what I mean? And then Sven, I think, has been significantly more consistent than Hylissang. You could talk about Fudge versus Wonder in the top lane. I think Fudge has certainly been up there. Blabber versus Razork, I would take Blabber. Humanoid certainly hasn't been the guy that would make me definitely take him over Jensen, and so Cloud9 to me feels like a very locked number 3 here, pretty much no matter who goes in, even if it is Mad Lions. Fnatic, I think, is the better team, is why I'm talking about them here, but if Fnatic joins this group, I definitely think they're kind of just a worse version of what a lot of the other teams in this group are offering. I wouldn't see them having a great chance unless a lot of what their problems have been throughout the year are rectified. A lot of the overextensions, a lot of the weird plays before 5 minutes. Unless a lot of those are changed, I really think that teams like T1, EDG, and Cloud9 are perfect examples of teams that can take advantage of weaknesses like that and really capitalize on them. So I think for Fnatic, this is about the worst draw you could have gotten into the group stage if you do end up making it out, which obviously this is the most likely destination for them. But, theoretically, they have the talent to be able to cause some upsets. I just don't know if I'd necessarily be one to predict that. So those are my Group A predictions. Let me know what you guys thought of this video down in the comment section below. And obviously, if you enjoyed the analysis, if you enjoyed all of the content that I'm putting out, the overview, everything of all the teams, leave a like. It really does mean a lot for the channel. It lets me know that you guys are interested in more Worlds content. We're going to be pumping out a ton, and if you guys are interested in seeing more of that, go ahead and hit the subscribe button, hit the bell, because you will be notified every single time I post a video for these World Championships. We're going to be going over all the groups, including plans. We're going to be doing a meta report. I'm going to be doing my top 20 players at Worlds, and then obviously once it starts, we'll be covering every single day. And so if you're excited for that, hit the subscribe button, hit the like button, all that stuff. It really does mean a lot for the channel when you guys do all that. But with all that being said, I hope you all are having a great day. I hope you continue to have a great day, and I will see you all later.